He rode into Ellsworth on a Sunday evening in the late summer of 1873, which was before the name meant anything, before the stories had accumulated into the specific weight that names acquire when enough people have told enough versions of them for long enough that the name itself becomes a shorthand for the weight. Before Dodge City and before Tombstone and before the Vendetta ride and before any of the specific events that would eventually make the name Wyatt Earp a communication in its own right, a communication that arrived in rooms before the man did work that the man himself had not yet arrived to do, and on the Sunday evening in the late summer of 1873 the name was simply a name. Was the name of a 25-year-old man on a horse who had come into Ellsworth from the west without announcement and without prior communication with anyone in the town and without any of the institutional backing that would eventually make his arrivals in towns a different kind of event. Then his arrival in Ellsworth on that Sunday evening, and the people of Ellsworth who saw him ride and saw a young man on a tired horse with a worn coat and a specific quality of attention in his eyes that some of them noticed and most of them did not, and the ones who noticed it did not yet have a framework for understanding what they were noticing, because the framework was something that the events of the following hours would begin to construct, and before those events the noticing had no more significance than the noticing of any quality in a stranger passing through. Ellsworth in the summer of 1873 was one of the cattle towns that the Kansas Pacific Railroad had made possible and the Longhorn drives from Texas had made necessary, a place that existed specifically because cattle and men and money needed somewhere to be between the ranges of Texas and the markets of the East, and that had in its brief existence accumulated the specific texture of a place that was doing necessary work without particularly wanting to do it, necessary in the sense that the economy required it and temporary in the sense that the economy would move on when a better option presented itself, and the people of Ellsworth understood both of these things and had organized their civic life around the tension between them, the tension between the desire to be a real town, a permanent place with permanent institutions and permanent residents and a permanent relationship with the future, and the reality of being a cattle town, which was a place that existed in relationship to the drives and the drovers and the specific violence and disorder that the drives and the drovers imported along with the cattle, and the management of this tension was the central challenge of civic life in Ellsworth in the summer of 1873, and the management was not going well. The man who had been managing it, or attempting to manage it, was a town marshal named Chauncey Whitney, who was a capable man placed in a position that had become, through the accumulation of circumstances that preceded his appointment and that he had not created and could not control, structurally impossible, a position in which the forces he was supposed to manage were more powerful than the tools available for managing them and in which the institutional support that a marshal needed to do the work of marshalling had been compromised by the same economic and political pressures that had made the work necessary in the first place, and Whitney had been doing the possible portion of an impossible job with a competence that was visible to the people who were paying attention and invisible to the people who were not, and on the Sunday evening when Wyatt Earp rode into Ellsworth from the west, Whitney was in the specific condition of a man who has been doing the possible portion of an impossible job for long enough that the possible portion has been getting smaller. The immediate cause of the specific crisis that the Sunday evening was the leading edge of was a Texan named Ben Thompson, who had come to Ellsworth with the most recent drive and who had the specific talent for creating situations that resolved themselves through violence that men of his type possessed and that made them simultaneously valuable to the people who needed that kind of talent deployed and dangerous to everyone in the vicinity when the deployment was not precisely controlled, and the lack of precise control was the condition that currently obtained in Ellsworth, because Ben Thompson's brother Billy had shot Marshal Whitney earlier that day in an incident that had both the qualities of accident and the qualities of inevitability that incidents of this type in cattle towns of this era always had, which was to say that the specific trigger had been accidental in the sense of not being deliberately aimed and inevitable in the sense of being the kind of thing that was always going to happen eventually given the configuration of the people and the tensions and the alcohol and the guns that the drive season produced in Ellsworth every summer, and Whitney was alive but incapacitated, and the town was in the specific condition that towns were in when the person responsible for managing its violence had been removed from that function by an act of the violence he was supposed to manage. Into this condition rode Wyatt Earp on his tired horse on a Sunday evening in the late summer of 1873, and the town he rode into was not looking for him specifically, was not looking for anyone specifically in the sense of having sent for a particular person with a particular reputation, was simply in the condition of a place that had a problem it could not currently address with the resources it had available, and that was experiencing the specific anxiety of that condition, the anxiety of a civic body that has lost the mechanism by which it managed its most dangerous element and is waiting for whatever is going to happen next without any particular ability to influence what that is, and the mayor of Ellsworth, a man named James Miller, who had been dealing with this condition since the early afternoon and who had exhausted the conventional options available to him by the time the evening arrived, was sitting in his office when someone came to tell him that there was a stranger in town who seemed like the kind of man who might be useful in the current circumstances, and Miller, whose standards for what constituted usefulness had become considerably more flexible over the course of the afternoon and evening, had sent for the stranger. Wyatt came to the mayor's office and sat across from Miller and listened to the description of the problem with the flat, patient attention that he brought to all problems that were being described to him for the first time, which was the attention of a man assembling a picture from its components rather than reacting to the picture before it was complete. And Miller watched him listen and arrived at the assessment that the person who had come to tell him about the stranger had also arrived at, which was that there was something in the quality of this young man's attention that was different from the attention of the other young men Miller had spoken to about the problem over the course of the day, different in a way that Miller could not immediately specify, but that he trusted in the specific way that men in urgent situations trust their instincts when their deliberate judgment has run out of options. And when Wyatt had heard enough of the description to have the picture he needed, he had asked Miller for the city marshal's badge, and Miller had looked at him for a moment, and then had given it to him. The badge was the beginning of the name, was the first element of the construction that would eventually produce the weight that the name carried, was the moment when the Sunday evening in Ellsworth began to become the story that would be told about it afterward, and Wyatt had taken the badge and pinned it to his coat and walked out of the mayor's office into the main street of Ellsworth, which in the late summer of 1873 was a street that he did not know in any operational sense, had not spent 3 weeks mapping the way he would spend 3 weeks mapping the streets of the towns he came to later, did not have the accumulated intelligence that preparation produced, had only the picture that Miller's description had given him and the picture that his eyes were giving him as he walked through the town toward the location that Miller had indicated as the probable location of Ben Thompson, and what his eyes were giving him was the picture of a town that was experiencing its problem in the way that towns experienced problems of this kind, which was through the specific combination of visible tension and deliberate invisibility that a place produced when the thing it was most worried about was present in it and operating. The tension visible in the faces of the people he passed and the invisibility visible in the way those same people were arranging themselves relative to the places where the problem was concentrated. He found Ben Thompson in the Drover's Saloon at the west end of the main street, which was where Miller had said he would be and where he was, sitting at a table with the specific quality of a man who has caused something significant to happen and is now in the position of waiting to see what the significant thing produces. The specific quality of a man who knows he is the center of a situation and is managing the knowledge with whatever combination of confidence and apprehension his character produced in response to it. And Wyatt had walked into the saloon and through the saloon to Ben Thompson's table and had stood in front of it, and the saloon had done the thing that saloons did when the specific configuration of this kind was present in them, which was to become very quiet very quickly in the way that rooms became quiet when the ambient tension had been building toward a resolution and the resolution had just arrived in the form of the person who was going to provide it. Ben Thompson looked at Wyatt Earp. Wyatt Earp looked at Ben Thompson. The assessment that each of them was conducting in that moment was the assessment that men of their respective types and capabilities conducted when they encountered each other for the first time in circumstances of this kind, the assessment of what the other person was and what that meant for the situation. And what Ben Thompson's assessment produced was something that he would have found difficult to articulate precisely if someone had asked him to, because the input that was driving the output of the assessment was not any specific observable fact about Wyatt Earp, was not the badge, which was new enough that its newness was visible, was not any visible sign of exceptional physical capability, was not any prior knowledge of reputation, because the reputation did not exist yet, but was something in the quality of Wyatt Earp's presence in the saloon, in the way he had walked through it, in the way he was standing at the table, in the specific texture of his attention, something that communicated to the part of Ben Thompson that was older than his professional confidence and his demonstrated capability and his 18 months of making Ellsworth manage itself around him, communicated to the part that recognized things before the conscious mind had assembled the recognition into a form that could be argued with, that the young man with the new badge standing at his table was not a version of anything he had previously encountered in Ellsworth and was not going to be addressed by the approaches that had addressed everything he had previously encountered in Ellsworth. Wyatt told Ben Thompson that his brother Billy needed to leave Ellsworth before morning. He said it in the voice that he would use for the rest of his career in situations of this kind, the voice that was not elevated and not lowered and that carried the specific quality of a statement rather than a request, the quality of a man communicating a fact about how things were going to be rather than a preference about how he would like them to be. And Ben Thompson heard the statement and ran the calculation that the statement required him to run, and the calculation produced a result that Ben Thompson had not anticipated producing, which was the result in which the calculation resolved in the direction of the statement being accepted rather than challenged, and the result surprised him in the specific way that results surprise men when the calculation produces something the inputs did not predict, and the surprise was information, was the first piece of the framework that would eventually explain what had just happened, the framework that the people of Ellsworth would spend the following morning constructing from the events of the night, the framework that would travel out from Ellsworth through the territory in the way that frameworks derived from significant events traveled, becoming the early version of the story that would become one of the early bricks in the construction of the weight that the name Wyatt Earp would eventually carry. Billy Thompson left Ellsworth before morning. He left because Ben Thompson told him to leave, and Ben Thompson told him to leave because the calculation had resolved in a direction that the 18 months in Ellsworth had not prepared him for, because the young man with the new badge had communicated something that required no elaboration and admitted no negotiation, and that the part of Ben Thompson that recognized things before the conscious mind assembled the recognition had already accepted as true before the conscious mind had finished running the calculation, and the acceptance was not cowardice and was not a failure of nerve, was simply the accurate processing of information that the calculation had produced, the information being that the situation had changed in a way that the previous approach to it was not equipped to address, and that the most rational response to this change was the response that preserved the maximum number of future options, which was departure. The morning in Ellsworth came with the specific quality that mornings had in towns where something significant had happened the night before, the quality of a place whose overnight experience had added something to its collective understanding that its daylight consciousness was in the process of integrating. And what the morning found in Ellsworth was a town in which the most immediate of its problems had been addressed and the specific mechanism by which it had been addressed was not yet fully understood but was already the subject of the conversations that would produce the understanding, and in those conversations the name Wyatt Earp appeared for the first time in the specific register in which it would appear for the rest of his life, which was the register of a name attached to an outcome that the outcome's observers found significant and wanted to understand. And the understanding they were constructing was not yet complete and would not be complete for some time, because the events of a single night in a cattle town were insufficient to construct the full understanding, were sufficient only to begin it, were the first accumulation in what would become, over the following years and the following towns, the accumulated weight that the name eventually carried. What the people of Ellsworth were constructing that morning, in the conversations that the previous night's events had made necessary, was the beginning of the story, the first version, still unpolished and still incomplete and still subject to the revisions that subsequent events and subsequent tellings would introduce, but accurate in its essentials, accurate in the way that first versions of true things are accurate before the process of repetition has added the embellishments and compressions that make them into legends, and the essentials that the morning's conversations were accurate about were these. That a young man nobody had known the previous evening had walked into the most difficult situation in Ellsworth at the most difficult moment in that situation, had addressed it with something that the witnesses could not precisely name but that they recognized as sufficient, and had produced an outcome that the previous several hours of conventional approaches had failed to produce, and that his name was Wyatt Earp, and that they would not forget it. They would not forget it. Attached to enough outcomes of the right kind for long enough, the thing that made a name a communication in its own right, that made it arrive in rooms before the man did and do work that the man himself had not yet arrived to do, and it was being constructed on a Sunday night in Ellsworth in the late summer of 1873 by a 25-year-old man who did not yet know what his name was going to mean, who was simply doing what the situation required in the way that he did things, which was completely and without remainder, and the town was learning his name in the morning because the night had given them a reason to learn it, and the reason was sufficient, and the name, once learned, was not forgotten, and the not forgetting was the beginning of everything that came after, every town and every situation and every outcome that added another layer to the weight, each layer making the name heavier, each layer making the communication more complete, until the name arrived in rooms before the man and did its work, and the rooms went quiet, and the calculations resolved, and the men across the tables made their decisions, and the decisions were always the same decision, and the decision was always the right one, because the name by then was the weight and the weight was the thing that had been accumulated across all the nights like the Sunday night in Ellsworth when nobody knew the name yet and they would by morning. And the morning always came, and the morning always knew, and the knowing spread, and the weight grew, and the name became what it became, which was the thing that preceded the man and did his work for him, which was the thing that the Sunday evening in Ellsworth had begun to build, which was the thing that every subsequent Sunday evening in every subsequent town had added to, which was Wyatt Earp, the name and the man and the weight of all the mornings that had learned what the previous nights had done. The Mayor Miller kept the city marshal's badge in his desk for a long time after Wyatt left Ellsworth, not as a relic and not as a memento in the sentimental sense, but as a specific object that he found himself thinking about occasionally in the years that followed, as the name he had given the badge to accumulated its weight and the weight became the thing that arrived in towns before the man did. And what he thought about when he thought about the badge was not the events of the night but the moment before them, the moment in his office when the stranger had sat across from him and listened to the description of the problem with the flat, patient attention of a man assembling a picture, and Miller had watched him listen and trusted something that he could not then and could not subsequently articulate precisely, a quality in the attention that communicated something he had recognized before he understood what he was recognizing, and he had given the badge to the stranger on the basis of that recognition, and the recognition had been correct, and the correctness of it had been the first confirmation of what the name would eventually mean, which was this: that the quality Miller had seen in the listening was the quality that determined the outcomes, was the thing that the arithmetic did not count and the dime novels did not capture and the witnesses could not describe, but that the rooms understood before the man opened his mouth, and that every badge and every town and every situation that followed from that Sunday evening in Ellsworth had confirmed, and that the name now carried as its primary content, the content that arrived before the man and organized the rooms before he spoke, the content that was not speed and not accuracy and not the specific courage of a man who walked into situations that other men walked away from, but was the quality Miller had seen in his office on a Sunday evening in the late summer of 1873, which was the quality of a mind that was completely present in what it was doing in the way that very few minds were ever completely present in anything, and which was, in the end, the only thing that the name had ever really meant. There is a specific moment in the construction of any reputation that is more significant than all the subsequent moments combined, which is the first moment, the moment before which the name is nothing and after which it is something, and the significance of this first moment is not visible from inside it, not to the man whose reputation is being constructed and not to the people doing the constructing, because from inside the first moment it looks like any other moment, looks like a situation that needs addressing and a person addressing it and an outcome that results from the addressing, and only in retrospect, from the vantage point of all the subsequent moments that the first moment made possible, does the first moment reveal itself as the first moment rather than simply as a moment, as the one that the weight began to accumulate around rather than the one that added to already existing accumulation. The Sunday evening in Ellsworth was Wyatt Earp's first moment, was the moment when the name began to mean something, and Wyatt did not know this at the time because there was no way to know it at the time, because knowing would have required the perspective of everything that came after, and what came after was not yet available to be known, was still ahead in the territory, in the towns that would need what Ellsworth had learned to need and would get it and would add their layer to the weight. Wichita and Dodge City and Prescott and Tombstone and all the others, each one a subsequent moment adding to what the first moment had begun, each one legible as a subsequent moment only because the first moment had established the category. What Chauncey Whitney had been unable to do in Ellsworth, working with the tools available to a man whose institutional position had been compromised by the pressures that made the position necessary, Wyatt had done on a Sunday night with a borrowed badge and the quality of attention that Miller had seen in his office and trusted before he understood what he was trusting, and the doing of it was the first demonstration of what the name would become, the first evidence accumulated in the case. That the territory would spend the following decades building, evidence that the specific configuration of qualities that Wyatt Earp had shown up in Ellsworth with was a configuration that produced outcomes in situations that other configurations did not produce outcomes in, and the building of this case was the building of the name, was the process by which the name acquired its weight, layer by layer, town by town, situation by situation, outcome by outcome, until the weight was sufficient to precede the man and do work in rooms he had not yet entered. Ben Thompson understood something about what had happened in the drover's saloon on the Sunday night that he would spend a long time trying to articulate and never quite manage, because the articulation required naming something that did not have a clean name in the available vocabulary, and what he eventually arrived at, in conversations years later when Wyatt Earp's name had accumulated enough weight that the people he was speaking to had a framework for what he was describing, was that the young man with the new badge had done something in the saloon that was technically the same as what every other lawman in Ellsworth had tried to do and that was functionally completely different, had made the same communication in the same register and produced a different result, and the difference in the result was not explicable by any difference in the content of the communication, because the content had been identical. Billy Thompson needed to leave before morning. But by a difference in the quality of the communicator, in the specific thing that the communication carried in addition to its content, which was the complete absence of doubt about whether the content would be acted upon. And this absence of doubt was not performed and was not projected and was not the result of a calculated display of confidence but was simply present in the communication the way that truth is present in a true statement, available to anyone who was paying attention to what they were receiving rather than only to what was being said, and Ben Thompson had been paying attention to what he was receiving, and what he had received was the absence of doubt, and the absence of doubt had been the determining factor, had been the thing that the calculation had processed and found impossible to argue with, and this was the first instance of the thing that would be the determining factor in every subsequent situation, which was not speed or courage or the weight of institutional backing but the specific quality of a man who had no doubt about what was going to happen because the outcome had already been determined somewhere in the space before the action and the action was simply the physical expression of a conclusion already reached. Ellsworth knew Wyatt Earp's name by morning. The knowing was simple and provisional and lacked all the elaboration that subsequent knowings would add, was simply the knowing of a name attached to an outcome, the most basic form of knowing that a reputation takes before it has been tested and confirmed and retested and reconfirmed enough times to become something more than a name attached to an outcome. And in this basic form it began the process that would occupy the following decades and the following territories and the following tellings, the process of becoming the thing that names become when the outcomes they are attached to are consistent enough and significant enough and numerous enough that the name acquires independent meaning, acquires the ability to communicate without the event that would otherwise be required to communicate, to arrive in rooms before the man and organize them before he speaks. And this process had begun on a Sunday night in Ellsworth in the late summer of 1873 when a 25-year-old man on a tired horse had ridden in from the west without announcement and without reputation and had walked into the most difficult situation in the town at the most difficult moment and had addressed it with the quality that was his and had always been his and would always be his, and by morning the name was known, and the knowing was the beginning, and what the beginning began was everything that came after, which was the whole of it, which was Wyatt Earp, which was what happens when a name and the weight it carries arrive in a room and the room goes quiet and the calculations run and the results come in and the results are always the same and the same is always right and the right has a name and the name is known and was known by morning and would be known by every morning that followed for as long as there were towns that needed the knowing and men who carried the weight and names that arrived before the men did and organized the rooms before the men spoke, which was always, which was the only constant, which was what Sunday evenings became when the man riding in from the west had what this man had, which was the thing that nobody could name and everybody recognized and that made the difference between the calculation resolving one way and resolving the other, and that was sufficient, and that was the name, and that was everything. The cattle towns of Kansas in the early 1870s were places that the American economy had produced for a specific purpose and that would be discarded when the purpose was served, places that knew this about themselves and organized their civic ambitions around the knowledge in the specific way that impermanent places organized their ambitions, which was with the particular combination of fierce present-tense investment and resigned future-tense acknowledgement that produced the texture of towns that were doing necessary work while knowing that the necessity was temporary, and Ellsworth in 1873 was one of the finest examples of this texture, a town that was fully alive in its present and fully aware of its contingency and that had, in the management of this awareness, developed the specific civic character of a place that took its current problems seriously precisely because its current problems were the only problems it was certain of having, the future being too uncertain to plan for. Beyond the next drive season. The drive seasons produced men like Ben Thompson the way that certain geological conditions produced certain minerals, reliably and in quantity, men for whom the specific configuration of skills and dispositions that the frontier required and rewarded had been selected into prominence by the experiences the frontier provided, and Ben Thompson was among the best examples of what the selection produced, which was a man who was competent and confident and dangerous in exactly the ways that the economy of violence required and who had, over the course of 18 months in Ellsworth, made the town manage itself around those qualities in exactly the way that men of his type made towns manage themselves around them, which was not through constant demonstration but through the credible promise of demonstration, the ambient knowledge that the demonstration was available and would be provided if the situation required it. And this ambient knowledge was the thing that the town's capacity to manage its own affairs had been organized around and that the incapacitation of Marshall Whitney had suddenly made unavailable in the specific way that the sudden unavailability of a load-bearing element makes unavailable whatever was being supported by it. What Wyatt had provided on the Sunday night was not a replacement for the load-bearing element but a different kind of support, a support that did not operate through the ambient threat of demonstration but through the specific quality of a presence that did not need demonstration to communicate what it needed to communicate, that communicated directly and completely through the fact of itself rather than through the threat of what it could do, and this difference was the essential difference between what Wyatt Earp was and what every other person who had attempted the same communication in Ellsworth that summer had been, and it was a difference that the town could not yet articulate on the Monday morning when it was learning his name, but that it had registered on the Sunday night when the outcome had been produced, registered in the specific way that bodies register things before minds have finished processing them, which was as the distinct sensation of something having been resolved that had not previously been resolvable, the sensation that accompanies the provision of the specific thing that a specific situation has been lacking, whatever that thing is and wherever it comes from and whoever it is that carries it into the room when the room has needed it long enough to have stopped believing it was coming. The room had stopped believing it was coming. And then it came. And the name came with it, and the name was Wyatt Earp, and by morning Ellsworth knew it, and the knowing was the first stone in the foundation of everything that would be built on top of it, every subsequent town and every subsequent situation and every subsequent morning that would learn the name from the night before, learning it the same way Ellsworth had learned it, from the fact of an outcome that should not have been possible and was, from the presence of a quality in a man that could not be named but could be recognized, from the specific sensation of something having arrived that had been needed and had come, and the coming was the name, and the name was the coming, and the two things were inseparable, and together they were Wyatt Earp, which was what nobody had known on the Sunday evening and what everybody would know by morning, and what the morning would tell to every subsequent morning, for as long as there were mornings that needed to know it, which was always, and the always was the name, and the name was the always, and on a Sunday evening in the late summer of 1873 in a cattle town in Kansas, the always began. James Miller told the story of the Sunday evening for the rest of his tenure as mayor of Ellsworth, and then for the rest of his life after that, and the story changed as all stories change through repeated telling, acquired the polish and the compression that repetition produces, lost some of its original uncertainty and gained some of the retrospective clarity that hindsight provided, became over time less the account of an improvised response to an immediate crisis and more the account of a recognition, of a moment when a civic leader had seen something true about a person before the events that would confirm the truth had occurred, and in this compressed and polished form it was a better story than the original and also a less accurate one, accurate in the way that legends are accurate, which is in their essential meaning rather than their specific detail, and the essential meaning that Miller's telling preserved was accurate, which was that on a Sunday evening in Ellsworth in the late summer of 1873 a young man had ridden into town who had something that the town needed and that nobody who had arrived before him had had, and that the town had known this by morning, and that the morning's knowing had been the beginning of a name that would become one of the names that the American West would remember longest and most completely, not because the name had been attached to the most violence or the most drama or the most of any of the things that the dime novels measured and celebrated, but because it had been attached to the most consistent and the most complete version of the specific quality that every town in every crisis needed and almost never found, which was the quality of a man who was entirely himself in the moments when everything required him to be, who brought to the situations that needed him the full weight of what he was without diminishment and without performance and without any of the gap between what a person appears to be and what they actually are that makes most people's presence in such situations insufficient, and this quality was the name, and the name was this quality. And on a Sunday evening in 1873 the town of Ellsworth had been the first to learn both things simultaneously, the name and the quality it named, and the learning had been the beginning, and the beginning had been the name, and the name had been Wyatt Earp.